And then there were two. Markets and the country focused on how a Biden presidency would differ from that of Donald J. Trump. This is a special election edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This week, former Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers. Former Secretary of HHS Kathleen Sebelius. Ralph Schlosstein of Evercore.
He's very squarely in the left center of the Democratic Party. He's a pro-capitalist.
Steve Rattner of Willett Advisors.
Investing is always a challenge, of course, in many respects, but this time around is different and more challenging because we are expected as investors to also become public health experts.
Former presidential candidate Tom Steyer. Michael Froman of Mastercard, and former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson.
Politicians believe that they need to tell the public what they want to hear, not what they need to hear.
Global Wall Street spent at least part of this week focused on the presidential election, with the nomination of Joe Biden for president and Kamala Harris for vice president.
This is a life-changing election. This will determine what America is going to look like for a long, long time.
Let's fight with conviction. Let's fight with hope. Let's fight with confidence in ourselves and a commitment to each other.
As we all try to come to terms with what a Biden administration would mean for the economy, for business, and for the markets. So this week, we have a special edition of Wall Street Week, one given over to the basic question of how President Biden would handle the key issues: the economy, taxes, climate and energy, healthcare, and foreign relations. Next week, we will do the same for President Trump's policies. We start tonight with international trade, something on which President Trump has unquestionably made his imprint. For a sense of how a Biden presidency might take a different approach, welcome now Michael Froman. He's vice chairman at Mastercard and former U.S. trade representative under President Obama. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, David.
So let's talk about international trade, and let's be more specific about it, because perhaps the biggest issue with President Trump has been his relations with China. How would that look different under President Biden than it has under President Trump?
Well, first, I'm not an advisor to the campaign, but I think it's clear that President Biden would focus first on the domestic agenda. And I think that's an important part of looking at trade through the domestic lens. One of the things I think if we look back historically, we've paid insufficient attention to are the domestic policy elements that need to be in place to help workers survive and succeed in a rapidly changing economy, whether that comes from technology or from trade. And as Vice President Biden has said, he wants to build back better, and he wants to focus on making sure we're driving more manufacturing in the United States, rebuilding communities, rebuilding infrastructure. And that, I think, is a necessary foundation for any trade policy. With regard to China, though, specifically, I expect him to be very strong on China. He's going to be very focused on holding China accountable for its policies that have a distortive effect on the rest of the global economy. I would expect him to differ from President Trump in how he might reach out and work with our allies and partners around the world, the Europeans, Canadians, Japanese, other major emerging economies. There's now more of a consensus out there domestically and with our trading partners about the challenge that integrating a China that follows a very different set of rules into the rules-based system, what that challenge is and how to address it. And I would expect a President Biden to take that on first and foremost.
If you were President Xi over in Beijing, would you feel better or worse about a President Biden versus a President Trump?
Well, I think he can probably count on more predictability and engagement, but I would not expect President Biden to be any less firm with China in terms of what he's going to be looking to China to do in terms of state-owned enterprise reform, reform of subsidies, opening up its economy. And that's just on the trade side, leaving aside issues around human rights, Hong Kong, South China Sea, and the rest. I think those issues are going to be very much on President Biden's agenda, but he will do so in a way that is more engaging and more building an international coalition of support around.
Michael, you mentioned our allies. What about trade relations with those? Because President Trump has not limited his tariffs, for example, to just China. He's imposed them on places like Canada and Europe and Australia. What about our allies?
Well, look, I think President Trump, by imposing and threatening to impose tariffs, certainly has gotten the attention of a lot of our allies, including on outstanding issues. I would expect a President Biden to be more focused on strengthening alliances, on strengthening partnerships, but again, not dropping those issues, making sure that we're pursuing those issues, but in a more collaborative way. And that goes for the global trading system more generally. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is very much in need of reform, and I would expect any Biden administration to pursue that reform aggressively, but not in a way that simply seeks to disrupt or blow up the institution.
Well, and what about U.S. withdrawal from things like the WTO, which is certainly on the table, and other organizations like WHO? There have been several international organizations that President Trump has either withdrawn from or said he might.
Well, most these organizations tend to serve our interests and our purposes very well, and particularly if we engage. If we have concerns about institutions, then we should be engaging to try to shape them, shape their agenda, shape their operating procedures, not withdrawing from them. And that goes for the WHO, it goes for the WTO, it goes for other organizations as well. And I would expect a Biden administration to be in that mode of engaging to change, engaging to reform, rather than simply taking our ball home.
Michael, one of the things that informs all of our discussion about the economy, about business, about anything in life right now is this pandemic. You have said that you actually think, ironically, there may be an opportunity for large corporations in the pandemic. Where do you see that opportunity?
Well, we've had a debate now over the last couple of years about the role of the corporation in society. It started with Larry Fink's letters and then the Business Roundtable statement. And when the pandemic hit and we saw this health crisis, this economic crisis, the impact on small business, and then also in the United States, the issues around racial reckoning, it has really required corporations to put those words into action. And for a company like Mastercard, we're very focused on inclusive growth. We've been doing this for years, bringing 500 million people into the financial system. And we're very much focusing on mobilizing hundreds of millions of dollars of our products and services and financial support to support small business, to deal with the issues of racial reckoning, to making it less expensive to be poor. Why should Black families pay 50% more for basic banking services than white families, the way they do right now in the United States? We should be able to do something about that. And I think every corporation in their own area has an opportunity to put the words of the BRT into practice and to make it not just a hobby, not just an issue for philanthropy, but part of the core business strategy.
Michael, that is a terribly important issue, and I dare say no one would deny that that needs to be done. But at the same time, can some of these corporations afford it? Because at the same time, because of the pandemic, we've seen corporations really loading up on debt. They're really pressed on their profits. Might they have to give up some of that initiative that you described?
I think that will be a knee-jerk potential reaction, but the reaction should be the opposite. If anything this crisis shows is that we need to invest in the long term, in healthier communities, in healthier societies, in more inclusive economies. Otherwise, we'll continue to have crises like this. And that's precisely why companies like ours, we partnered with the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust in the UK to create the accelerator for therapeutics for COVID. Not because we're a public health company, but because we saw that it was in our interest that the development and deployment of a therapy, of a treatment for COVID, be accelerated as quickly as possible. And I think that's what companies need to do, is look not just at the short run, but what they need to create long-term value.
Quickly, Michael, you're selling it really well. Are other companies buying it?
You know, I think they are, all in their own ways, and particularly around, for example, issues of racial reckoning in the United States. They're seeing how important it is for their employees, for the communities in which they operate, for their customer base, for their partners. And I think increasingly investors are looking to those companies that take ESG not as a box checking exercise, but seriously as part of their corporate strategy.
Really important point. Thank you so much to Michael Froman. He is Mastercard Vice Chairman. Thank you for being with us, Michael. Coming up, Joe Biden plans to pay for things like health care and clean energy by raising our taxes. We talk with Ralph Schlosstein of Evercore and Steve Rattner of Willett Advisors about what a tax hike would mean for the investing world.
It'll have probably a little bit of an effect on the stock market, but that's not a lot more than 1 year's earnings growth.
It is the toughest time to invest in my entire career.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Democratic nominee Joe Biden has big plans, and he's not afraid of paying for them with taxes. He plans to raise the top tax rate on individual income to just under 40% for those earning over $400,000 a year, with the top 1% of households bearing 3/4 of that burden.
Joe's plan to build back better includes making the wealthy pay their fair share, holding corporations accountable.
Capital gains taxes would also go up to 39.6% for those with an income of over $1 million a year. President Trump, on the other hand, says he is considering cutting that rate.
It's a way that will build on the middle class, and it's a way that isn't about pitting one group against another group.
The Democratic nominee's plans also mean big changes for some of the most profitable companies. Biden plans to raise the corporate tax rate to 28% and impose a 15% minimum tax on profits reported to shareholders.
You know, electing Biden and Harris, as much as it's going to be great for the country, is not going to be great for the market.
I asked Evercore co-chairman and co-CEO Ralph Schlosstein what the Biden-Harris proposals would mean for the investment banking business.
If you look at Vice President Biden's record, both in the Senate and when he was vice president to President Obama, he's very squarely in the left center of the Democratic Party, He's a pro-capitalist. I think his selection of Kamala Harris as vice president, who I also believe is pro-capitalism, sets a course that is, in my view, the right course for our country. A commitment to private enterprise, but also to a more balanced distribution of wealth and to access to health care and education as more of a right in our society than a privilege.
You guys are the investment bankers par excellence. Did you see an uptick in business when the rate went down so far for corporations? And then on the flip side, if it went back up to 28%, which is what Vice President Biden's talking about, would that hurt your business?
I think really neither an uptick nor a downtick. And let me explain why. All the corporate rate does is it basically redraws a little bit the line between of the pre-tax earnings, what goes to shareholders and what goes to the government. We had a policy that 35% went to the government and 65% went to shareholders. That was quite honestly out of step and non-competitive with the rest of the world. I think generally the majority of the world, the developed world, is in the 25 to 28% range. So where 25 to 28% of the pre-tax profits go to the government and the rest go to shareholders. That's important because we don't want to lose businesses domiciling in the United States because they perceive relative to other countries that too much of their pre-tax earnings are being taken by government. At 21%, we're probably out of step a little bit with all but the tax havens in the other direction. So what does this really mean if it goes to 28%, as Vice President Biden has suggested? Instead of 79% of pre-tax earnings going to the shareholders, 72% will go. So that's roughly a 10% decline in net income and earnings per share. It'll have probably a little bit of an effect on the stock market, but that's not a lot more than 1 year's earnings growth, to be honest.
That was Schlosstein of Evercore. Investors have a lot to price in during any election year, but this year it's particularly difficult because of the ongoing global pandemic. That's something I asked Steve Rattner about. Steve is chairman and CEO of Willett Advisors, which invests the personal and philanthropic assets of Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of our parent company.
Investing is always a challenge, of course, in many respects, but this time around is different and more challenging because we are expected as investors to also become public health experts, because so much of what we do will ultimately be driven by the path and course of this virus. If you tell me there's going to be a vaccine and we're going to essentially be back to a fully functioning economy in December, I'd have one view. If you tell me it could be years, I might have another view. So it is the toughest time to invest in my entire career. But look, we are long-term investors. I don't know how to do market timing. Every time I've tried, it's not really worked well, or at least on balance, I don't think I've accomplished anything by doing it. And so we remain essentially more or less fully invested. We move some pieces around, try to find the best opportunities. But I do believe that in the fullness of time, markets go up, equity markets go up, and we should be in them.
So it's awfully hard to be an investor and an epidemiologist at the same time, in my experience. But we all listen to these experts, medical doctors, others that come on, Dr. Fauci, others. What happens to the economy? What happens to investments if, in fact, we don't get a vaccine at least anytime soon, within the next 2 years or so? Certainly a vaccine that 100% cures this disease. But we do start to accommodate it. We learn to live with it almost like a chronic disease in our society. What is that? Does that make a material difference to investments into the economy?
Yes, because I think what happens and what I worry about is that the economy, a certain amount of the economy will absolutely come back. People are working, jobs are being created, and so on. But that last 10 or 20%, which is absolutely essential to having a fully functioning economy, the travel industry, the entertainment industry, all the things that the sports, all the things that bring people into closer contact may not come back under your scenario, in which case you have an economy that is limping along well below its full potential, with unemployment that is quite high by historic standards, and people getting increasingly concerned, worried, and grumpy about it. So yes, that last 10 or 20% actually is the key to whether we have a full recovery or not, and that is dependent on whether people can go back to not just working, but living, traveling, entertaining themselves, doing all the things they like to do as they were doing it back in January and February. The lack of legislation is going to produce a serious fiscal drag on the economy. There's no question. As the unemployment benefits run out, you go back to the low levels that we had before. As the PPP money runs out, as the state and local governments, and you can see this very clearly in the monthly unemployment numbers, cut back to, because they are required by law in almost every case to balance their budgets. It's an enormous drag on the economy, and that's what you are starting to see. You have had this deceleration in job growth. There are people who think August job numbers could be worse still, possibly little or no job growth. I don't know. I'm not here to make that prediction, but it's possible. So there's no question that the momentum of the economy is ebbing. If you look at things like credit card data, it's plateaued at about 10 or 15% below last year's levels. And that gets back to what I was saying before about not achieving a full recovery.
That was Steve Rattner of Willett Advisors. Coming up, the cost of clean energy. We talked to former presidential candidate Tom Steyer about Joe Biden's climate plans.
What this plan does is it's aggressive about a goal for creating clean electricity generation by 2035.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Democratic nominee Joe Biden plans to spend $2 trillion over 4 years on clean energy, and rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement is at the top of his list.
We can and we will deal with climate change. It's not only a crisis, it's an enormous opportunity. An opportunity for America to lead the world in clean energy and create millions of new, good-paying jobs.
His extensive plan calls for the eliminating of all carbon emissions in the production of electricity for the power grid by 2030, then pressing on to reach net zero emissions overall by 2050. The biggest emitters of CO2 today are China, the United States, and the European Union.
While it's an ambitious plan, the industry is well positioned because of our infrastructure already available to expand and grow quickly.
And presidential candidate Biden says clean energy policies will create jobs, including 10 million union jobs and 1 million new jobs in the auto industry.
He's given us smart, detailed plans to invest in areas vital to our future. Innovative financing for modern factories and small businesses. Good jobs in green energy and conservation to combat climate change.
The Biden plan does not ban fracking or rule out nuclear power and other technologies that have divided environmental advocates. Tom Steyer, founder of Next Gen America and former Democratic presidential candidate himself, put climate change at the heart of his policies during his candidacy. I asked him whether Democrats can unite behind Biden's climate plans.
It is a plan that deals very aggressively with our need to change our climate affecting energy policies. But it is also an environmental justice program at its heart, putting the clean air and clean water in underserved Black and brown communities at the very heart of the program. And it is also a huge union jobs program across America because we need to rebuild this country in a sustainable and resilient fashion. So I think what they're talking about in healthcare, I think what they're talking about in terms of climate is a broad-based change, a transformative change to America to get us back on track in every way and to pull us together. And that's why I think that's what you're going to see over 4 days. You're going to see the party come together, and you're going to see excitement around the idea that we can change and be effective and move forward together. I'm very excited about it myself.
So, Tom, you've been on the subject of climate for a good long time. I mean, you really are an expert in this area. And I take your point about the plan. How's it going to play in Pennsylvania, just to pick a state, which is a key battleground state? And there's a lot of concern, for example, about eliminating fracking.
Well, I think what this plan does is it's aggressive about a goal for creating clean energy, clean electricity generation by 2035. But what it's going to do is it recognizes that's really aggressive. And we're going to have to get going on day one. But we're also, look, I said Joe Biden leads with his heart. He leads with his heart. He cares about people. And he specifically has his heart and soul in the working people and working families of America. So he is going to make sure that he takes care of union members who are working in industries that can decline or are going to decline. And I think that that's absolutely front and center. I've heard him talk about this numerous times, and he never doesn't say that. And it's something that is absolutely front and center for him. And that's why the head of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Lonnie Stevenson, who heads the biggest energy union in the country, is strongly supporting the Biden-Harris ticket because he knows that they are going to create millions of union jobs and are going to take care of union workers in declining industries. And that's not a promise, end of the story promise. Oh yeah, we'll do that too. That's front and center in who Joe Biden is and where his heart is, and people can believe it because it's true.
You've been very active at getting younger voters out with your Next Gen America project. At the same time, it's going to be harder to do that on college campuses this time. How does it change your efforts?
We believe that our virtual organizing of people between 18 and 35 will be more effective than we've ever been.
That was Tom Steyer, former Democratic presidential candidate. Coming up, settling the health care debate within the Democratic Party. We talked to former HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius about the evolution of Biden's health care plan.
What you're seeing is sort of an evolving approach that's likely to continue to evolve, which is good news.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Healthcare policy has long been a centerpiece for Democrats, even if they don't always agree on what to do about it. Joe Biden was central to former President Obama's Affordable Care Act, signed into law on March 23, 2010. If elected, Democratic nominee Biden plans to build on the ACA.
Well, the health care system that lowers premiums, deductibles, drug prices. By building on the Affordable Care Act, he's trying to rip away.
During the primary season, progressive Democrats like Senator Bernie Sanders pushed for an alternative, Medicare for all. Joe Biden's plan stopped short of that while protecting those with pre-existing conditions and providing a Medicare-like public insurance option.
He's also a political realist. He realizes Medicare for all, a single-payer system, is not going to happen.
In an effort to lower drug prices, Biden's plan would repeal the current law that bans Medicare from negotiating lower prices with drug manufacturers and would limit price increases for brand and generic drugs.
While Joe and I disagree on the best path to get universal coverage, he has a plan that will greatly expand health care and cut the cost of prescription drugs.
Kathleen Sebelius served as the HHS Secretary under President Obama and implemented the Affordable Care Act. I asked her about the approach the Democratic Party is taking toward health care policy.
I think that what you're seeing is sort of an evolving approach that's likely to continue to evolve, which is good news. There is a unifying principle of the Democratic Party that we saw in the last 50 years, which is a belief that all Americans deserve a right to health care. And so the Biden campaign had staked out a improvement of the Affordable Care Act, solidifying a lot of the issues that the Trump administration has eroded in the last 3 years, even though they couldn't manage to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which was one of Trump's promises. They have definitely cut it with 1,000 knives. And he also, I think, staked out a very robust public option plan, a lower price, lower administrative cost option for people to choose in the marketplaces, and a lower age for Medicare recipients to be able to sign on to Medicare, moving the age from 65 to 60. So that was the position in March. As you say, Bernie Sanders had a Medicare for all. Elizabeth Warren supported that. Kamala Harris was a longer transition, but eventually ending up with Medicare for all. Now what we have is a pretty robust Biden plan on the website. You have a unity document, which is the Sanders delegates and the representatives of Joe Biden's health policy team meeting over a series of times and putting out some proposals that I would say move even further down the road on a plan for universal coverage, and particularly pay attention to the millions of people who have lost coverage because of COVID-19.
Secretary Sebelius, do we know how much this will all cost to really buttress Obamacare and move toward Medicare for all? Are we putting any costs against that, and how are we going to pay for it?
We always talk about cost as if it's a net zero game, that if we insure more people in America, it will cost X amount. What we don't ever do is say how much it costs if we don't move in that direction, if we leave large portions of our population uninsured or underinsured. What is the cost of that? I think what we're seeing with COVID-19 and the miserable way this administration has handled this response is there is an enormous cost in productivity of our communities, in the opportunity for our economy to move forward if we don't get health care right. We have had a series of situations where people are unable to return to work. They cannot safely put their kids in school because we don't have a handle on health care in this country. And I think that will shine a very bright light on the gaps that we have, which frankly no other developed country in the world has, with our healthcare system, and particularly shine a bright light on Black and brown communities, which have taken the brunt of this virus. But I don't think we've ever had a situation where the connection between healthcare and the economy is more clear. So there's an enormous cost of doing nothing.
That was former HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius. Coming up, the world order under a President Biden. We talked to former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson about how Biden would tackle global issues.
He believes that in order to get stuff done, you have to work with people on both sides of the aisle.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. When it comes to foreign policy, Democratic nominee Joe Biden's election could mark a return of the old guard and an attempt to return to the world order before the Trump administration.
Joe understands our values don't limit our power, they magnify it. He knows you can't spread democracy around the world if you don't practice it at home.
Biden foreign policy would focus on restoring alliances with other nations.
Joe Biden will be a president we will all be proud to salute. With Joe Biden in the White House, you will never doubt that he will stand with our friends and stand up to our adversaries, never the other way around.
One of the most important and difficult issues for a new administration would be U.S.-China relations, which have grown more confrontational since the Obama-Biden administration.
In the short run, I'm actually quite worried about a military incident. In the longer run, David, I'm actually concerned about a U.S.-Chinese Cold War.
Some say U.S. global leadership has suffered because of our response to the coronavirus. And that is one thing the Democratic Party is pointing to in its unification behind Joe Biden.
COVID hit us much harder than it had to. We have just 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's COVID cases.
No matter who takes the White House next year, COVID-19 will be on the roster of global issues. But that will not be the only thing facing the President of the United States. I asked former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson about what will be in the president's inbox.
What's in their inbox? Well, first of all, experience teaches, history teaches, that one could never fully know what's awaiting you in your inbox when you take office on January 20. I mean, George Bush 43, for example, could not have known on January 20, 2001, that he was going to be grappling with 9/11 and the aftermath 9 months later. But obviously, in terms of security issues, COVID, I fully expect that we'll still be wrestling with COVID, the pandemic, by January. Longer term challenges, global warming, the threats represented by China, by Russia, by Iran, specifically the cybersecurity threats. ODNI recently put out statements about how the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians are messing around with our democracy. So there will be any number of challenges facing whoever the president is in the next presidential term.
So the COVID-19, to take that first one first, because it's so much on everyone's mind right now. What leadership do we need, whether we've had it or not, when you have that kind of crisis? I mean, it's a pandemic we haven't seen for over 100 years now. But what is leadership in that sort of crisis?
Good question. I think the answer is staring us in the face. I think we've seen some very good examples of leadership through this crisis. And what the American people, in my experience and in my observation, most appreciate about good leadership is simply telling us the truth. What is the truth about the danger we face and how we solve it and what we, the American public, can do to solve it? Too often politicians believe that they need to tell the public what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. And in my experience, if you simply are straight with the American people, if you tell the truth about the problem and how to solve it, they will respond. If you treat the public like grown-ups and not as fools, we will respond. And so in a number of jurisdictions in a number of states around the country, including here in the Northeast, we've had strong leadership that has encouraged discipline when it comes to physical distancing, wearing masks, and the trend lines in New York State have all been good from the depths of where we were in say, mid-April, because people have been oriented toward not becoming casual and not letting their guard down and taking this very seriously, thanks to the leadership, I believe, of Governor Cuomo and his straight talk to New Yorkers.
Leaders in large organizations also have a challenge often of the urgent driving out the important. You deal with the thing coming across your desk every day because it's there and it needs an answer. but you then don't deal with some of the more important issues. When it comes to national security, to Homeland Security, what are the, if I can put it this way, existential questions, the one we cannot afford to get wrong?
Well, first, any major, what we cannot afford to get wrong, any risk of an attack, any attack that is of high consequence. Some are higher probability, some are lesser probability, but you have to keep your eye on all of it. This is one of the reasons, David, I keep talking about climate change, global warming. It is not always at the top of the inbox in terms of a crisis that a president or a Secretary of Homeland Security or a Secretary of Defense has to deal with. It is, as I think Barack Obama once put it, a slow motion emergency that tends to exist in the inbox, but not always at the top of the inbox, which is why it is so important for people in office, particularly in national security, who are dealing day to day with one crisis or another, multiple crises in a week, to keep in mind the longer term challenges we have to our homeland security, to our public safety, to our national security, and don't lose sight of those. To me, a good day in office was when most of the meetings on my calendar were meetings that I requested to address longer term issues versus the meetings that were thrust upon me to deal with the shorter term crises.
You served with Vice President Biden, so you got to see him in action. Give us your synopsis of him as a leader.
I believe Joe Biden is a consensus builder. I know from many discussions with him that he believes that in order to get stuff done, you have to work with people on both sides of the aisle. He did that for 36 years in the Senate. I believe he will continue that style if elected. And I actually believe that's the correct approach. That's how I tried to operate when I was in Washington as a cabinet official and as a Defense Department official. You have to work with people across the aisle in order to get stuff done.
That was Jeh Johnson, former Homeland Security Secretary. Coming up, dealing with an economy hit by COVID-19. Former Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers talks about what the economy might look like under a Biden-Harris administration.
We're going to see an economic strategy that enables the United States to compete.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Those who thought that if anything so horrible as the election of a Democrat should occur, the bond market would panic and gold would soar, turned out to be suffering from just another superstition.
That was Louis Rukeyser following the election of Bill Clinton back in November of 1992. This election year, the economy is taking on new importance as the country struggles to return to work and reopen schools. Former Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers has made no secret of his support for Joe Biden's proposals.
We'd be basically competent in the work of government, whether you had a conservative or whether you had a progressive ideology. And we'd care. We would care about a country that was still divided by race. We would care about middle-class people who literally weren't able to feed their kids because they'd lost their jobs because of pandemic. We would be fighting to protect people who were unemployed rather than to slash their benefits.
So Larry, some people you know and I know who are investors, who are on Wall Street, who are in business, might say competence is great, caring is great. At the same time, we need real growth. And the priorities are wrong for Joe Biden because at least Donald Trump put as his priorities growth of the economy. We need that growth. Can Joe Biden bring that back with his competence and his caring?
Well, I think we should start with this. If you look consistently, for 50 years, 60 years actually, Democratic administrations produce more rapid growth in median family incomes. Democratic administrations produce more rapid growth in real wages. Democratic administrations produce lower unemployment. Now, you might say that's because they don't care about business. But here's the thing. Because building from the middle out is the economic strategy that works, Democratic administrations produce more rapid growth in corporate profits. Democratic administrations produce better returns for stock market investors. That pattern was first pointed out 3 decades ago, and it's continued to be true over the subsequent 3 decades. And that will be true with a Biden presidency. Certainly, we're not looking at a strong period for American business with the profit figures we're seeing right now, or a strong period for American labor with the unemployment figures that we're seeing right now. So we're going to see an economic strategy that enables the United States to compete. When we alienate every other country in the world, talking about steel tariffs on Canada for national security reasons, we are putting it to American exports and putting it to American business. And so the way to help the economy, the way to rescue from problems that have been made by the other administration is Bill Clinton turned around a mess that he had inherited. Barack Obama turned around a mess that he inherited. Jimmy Carter inherited a recession. John Kennedy inherited a recession. A commitment to policies that expand the economy from the middle out. Going back to FDR, that has been the commitment of Democratic presidents, and Joe Biden will be in that tradition. And the historical evidence is that it works. And the historical evidence is that the trickle-down, short effort to reduce the taxes of big donors doesn't work. It produces stock market bubbles that ultimately implode and lead to grave recessions. And that's not the right economic strategy for our country.
Larry, help us understand, if you can, one aspect about Joe Biden's plans. He has some very robust plans when it comes to the climate, infrastructure, education, which will cost a fair amount of money, which he owns up to. And he talks about taxes, taxes on corporations, taxes on some wealthy individuals to pay for that. At the same time, he says that we have to be careful about taxes depending on where the economy is. Give us a sense of the sequencing here. Is this going to be borrowing money until we can afford actually to raise the taxes, or will there be taxes from day one?
That's for a President Biden to declare and Congress to legislate, and the answers will depend on where the economy is at the time. I'll tell you, though, David, I don't think austerity economics is the answer in this moment. We're about to get a huge demonstration of that from the huge fiscal cliff the country's about to go over because the Republicans wouldn't negotiate with the Democrats. Yes, we've got to make the right choices about borrowing money and how much to borrow now and in what ways we should tax those with the highest income. But that's not the important deficit we have in our country. The important deficit we have in our country is that we somehow decided we couldn't afford to invest in having pandemic readiness. And we cut all those programs because people were fixated on the deficit. The important deficit in our country is we can't afford to buy tests, even though the benefit of each test that we give is probably over $1,000 in terms of the costs of the pandemic and the disease that is prevented. Let's focus on the things that are most important. And they are not austerity economics at a moment of zero interest rates. They are investing in the future. And that is what the Biden program is all about, along with making sure that everybody has a chance to share in that prosperity. Think about it. When it looks like the stock price of some companies might fail, or they might not be able to issue debt at a low interest rate, we rush to the rescue with quantitative easing. When unemployed people have hungry kids, Congress goes into recess with the enthusiasm of the president. It's not right. And it's not that hard to fix. The profoundly good news for a Biden administration amidst all the problems, David, is that there are huge amounts of low-hanging fruit.
That was Larry Summers of Harvard. Finally, one more thought. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This week we saw history made when the first African American and Asian American woman was nominated to the second highest position in the country. And in her acceptance speech, Senator Kamala Harris talked about the challenges we face, but promised to help build a community to overcome them.
We are a nation that is grieving the loss of life, the loss of jobs, the loss of opportunities, the loss of normalcy, and yes, the loss of certainty. Joe and I believe that we can build that beloved community, one that is strong and decent, just and kind.
But 44 years ago, another African American woman also made history when Representative Barbara Jordan was the first ever to address a political convention. And more than a generation ago, she too talked about the challenges the nation faced, and she too talked about building a community that could overcome those challenges by ensuring true equality throughout society.
We are a people in a quandary about the present. We are a people in search of our future. We are a people in search of a national community.
Lofty goals, reminding us once again that a national election is not all about the candidates or about their programs. It is also about all of us as a nation and where we want to head. That does it for this special edition of Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This is Bloomberg. See you next week.